They did not say it out loud, but the looks in the Plaza Ballroom were sharp enough to cut into flesh. When Emma covered her ears and slid back toward the wall, as if trying to disappear, the faces around her changed. Whispers slipped through the music. "What's wrong with that girl?" Someone else glanced at Alex and curled their lips slightly, as if they had just spotted a rare weakness in a female CEO who lived by a flawless image. No one reached out to help. They stood and watched, as though witnessing a crack in a mask of power was the evening's entertainment. Alex knelt under those stairs, trying to sign but stumbling again and again, heads tilted, the kind of watching done by people who want to see how long someone can hold themselves together. A camera light even swept across her face, as if deliberately capturing the moment of collapse. Then, from the back of the room, the sound of a man's shoes broke the rhythm. Ethan stepped out of the invisible space everyone was used to ignoring. He knelt to Emma's eye level and signed, each movement firm and slow. Within seconds, Emma began to breathe again, then smiled. The entire ballroom stalled, an unnatural silence, as if they had just seen something they were not meant to see. A cold voice rose. "What are you doing there?" Under the probing looks, people expected Ethan to step back, but he only looked up, calm enough to make the room uneasy, and said simply, "A child needs to be understood, that's all." If you were Alex, would you dare stand tall while an entire room treated your child's vulnerability as a performance? Would you stay composed while strangers stared at the moment your child was about to break? What do you think about this moment? Leave a comment, and if you want to keep watching stories that strip away the truth inside rooms full of power, hit subscribe now. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel gleamed as if it had been built to display everything, from crystal chandeliers overhead to silhouettes moving beneath layers of warm, golden light. Music filled the space in heavy layers, conversation weaving with the clink of glasses into a dense mixture that adults considered festive atmosphere. No one imagined this place could turn into a maze for an 8-year-old child. Emma stood pressed against the wall to the left of the stage, her eyes following moving mouths she could not keep up with. Reflected lights flashed repeatedly, making her eyes ache, while laughter bursting from a nearby group sent a burning sensation through her left ear like needles. She raised a hand to cover her right ear, then her left, her breathing growing fast and shallow. Each breath seemed to catch in her throat. Alex stood less than a meter from her daughter. She wore a dress prepared weeks in advance for the event, her posture balanced, her soft smile practiced in the mirror. But all of it became meaningless the moment she saw Emma's shoulders tighten with every loud sound. Alex lowered her voice, crouched to close the distance, then raised her hands in front of her daughter to sign a few simple words she had learned in a crash course. The movements lacked rhythm, lacked flow, lacked the smoothness they required. Her fingers trembled, especially when she saw Emma shake her head, eyes wet, gaze dropping to the floor. Emma signed rapidly into the space before her chest, the gestures sharp and forceful, carrying urgency Alex could not follow. She signed that it was too loud, that her ears hurt, and that she wanted to leave the room immediately. The sound of a glass clinking behind Alex made Emma jerk backward as if someone had yanked her. Her arm brushed lightly against the buffet table, then lifted again into a guarded stance. A camera operated by an event staff member pointed straight at the mother and daughter, the small light on its body, flashing on like a signal that this moment was being recorded. Alex tilted her head slightly away from the lens, but the image had already been caught by several people nearby. She forced a smile to preserve her image, but her lips twitched. Emma kept retreating until her back hit the wall. Her small body nearly merged with the cold surface, as if only by pressing herself flat could she shrink away from the assault of sound. Alex lifted her hand to touch her daughter's shoulder, but stopped halfway when she saw Emma angle her body slightly away, as if a defensive reflex had taken over before conscious thought. At the far end of the room, Ethan stood beside the drinks counter, holding a glass of water he had picked up at the start of the evening. He disliked harsh lighting and overlapping voices, but he was here tonight because the contract required it. That contract was thin enough for him to know that one wrong step could cost him his job. Even so, he could not take his eyes off Emma's fear. Every small movement of the girl pulled Ethan back to Noah. His 11-year-old son had once stood in crowds with the same lost look in his eyes. Ethan had learned sign language to help his child through each panic episode, to pull him back from chaos that hearing people did not even know existed. The glass in Ethan's hand tilted, reflecting scattered light. His grip tightened until his knuckles turned white. He had not planned to intervene, only to watch, but when he saw Emma signing frantically and then covering her ears with both small hands, he knew the feeling too well to stay still. Ethan set the glass down on the table, the sound of glass touching stone so soft no one noticed. He stepped out of the shadowed corner of the room, moving in steady, deliberate strides. His shoes struck the polished floor in a rhythm entirely separate from the surrounding noise. When he reached Emma, Ethan did not call her name, nor did he speak aloud, because he understood she would not hear him. He knelt at her eye level, maintaining a safe distance, without applying pressure. Alex turned immediately when she saw a man crouching beside her child. Her face tightened, one hand bracing at her waist, as if to steady herself. But Ethan had already raised his hands, slow and clear, each motion rounded and firm. He signed that it was loud here, that her ears were tired, that no one was hurting her, that she could look at him to find her breath again. Emma opened her eyes a little wider, fixing on the movement of the hands as they formed a language familiar to her. Her gaze followed every shape. Ethan added a few small gestures to guide her into deeper breaths. Emma followed, her breathing lengthened, her shoulders lowered, her hands dropped away from her ears. Her whole body softened, like someone releasing after holding tension for too long. Alex watched every movement from behind, unable to step in. She did not want to admit it, but she understood. She had just exposed a weakness in a room built on elegance. Some nearby guests lowered their phones, others raised them, discreetly recording Ethan and Emma. An event manager whispered something to a colleague, eyes fixed in their direction. Emma signed a short sentence, gentler this time, and the corners of her mouth curved slightly. She said that the person in front of her was truly listening to her. A smile escaped, unforced, unafraid of the lights. It was simply the relief of a child who had found solid ground again. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted. Laughter dropped by a beat, and more gazes turned toward Alex than toward Emma. A strange reaction spread as people began to realize that power did not always help a mother do the simplest thing. Alex found herself standing without remembering when she had risen, her polite smile still fixed in place while her eyes no longer were. She looked at her daughter, at Ethan, then at the phones still glinting among the crowd. The clearest difference was Emma's smile, proof written plainly on a child's face. Alex opened her mouth to ask Ethan a question, her voice catching slightly. Ethan swallowed before answering that he had seen the same situation with his own son. Each sentence felt like it pulled the entire ballroom into a tense quiet. Alex meant to say something more, perhaps a thank you, perhaps a careful boundary. But Emma tugged at her sleeve and looked up, with eyes still holding light from that earlier smile. A camera swept past again, closer this time. Notification sounds from Alex's phone rang out in quick succession, sharp as knocking. She glanced down at the screen, where a message reported that the video was spreading internally. Another message followed immediately, announcing a board meeting at 7 the next morning. The skin at the back of Alex's neck went cold, while Ethan's back stiffened as murmurs around them began to stack into louder layers. He did not know whether he had done the right thing or made everything worse. Ethan looked at Emma, at the small face that had just regained its calm, then at the scrutinizing gazes of adults now fixed on him as if he had crossed a line. A contract employee was not meant to approach. Alex turned fully, positioning herself in front of her daughter. Her eyes locked on Ethan as she spoke the final question. "What are you going to do?" The moment Alex spoke out loud to question Ethan, the space between them vibrated lightly, as a string struck too hard. Several people nearby stopped their conversations mid-sentence, a few gazes locking onto the three figures at the center of the dance floor. The music still played through the speakers, but something felt off, as if each melody were being swallowed beneath a layer of whispers rising from all directions. Ethan kept his distance, his head slightly lowered to avoid seeming threatening. He rested his hands on his knees, breathing evenly, his gaze fixed on Emma, as if signaling that he was still holding the safe position he had chosen. Alex stood upright, her shoulders slightly drawn in with tension. Emma, between the two adults, kept her hands raised near her chest, ready to defend herself, but her eyes had softened after recognizing the familiar language coming from Ethan. Ethan glanced at Alex briefly, then returned his focus to Emma. He did not offer a long explanation to the tense mother standing behind him. Alex could blame him, could demand that he leave, but the most important thing right now was to keep Emma's breathing from slipping back into the panic she had just escaped. He lifted his hands to Emma's eye level and signed a short sentence. Each movement was clear and slow, so she could follow. He signed that she could look at him for a moment, could focus on this motion to quiet the noise in her head, that no one would come closer unless she wanted them to. Emma followed the paths of his fingers, the tightness easing in her gaze. Her breathing lengthened into a steady, deep rhythm. When Ethan added a description of placing a hand on her chest to feel her heartbeat again, Emma followed, her palm resting on her red dress. Her small chest rose and fell in an even pattern. An event manager standing between two banquet tables watched the scene and tilted his head to ask a nearby staff member, his voice low but still audible to a cluster of guests. He wondered whether the man kneeling there belonged to an outsourced support team. The question drifted through the room and caught several attentive glances. Alex heard it. She held herself for a beat, her hand tightening slightly, then stepped half a pace forward to increase the space between Ethan and her daughter. She spoke in a low, measured voice, asking Ethan why he had approached her child without permission. Her tone carried the restraint of someone accustomed to standing before cameras, but also a layer of genuine concern. Ethan looked up at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but no resistance. He said quietly that Emma was afraid, and he had seen it. A short sentence, dry and plain like the simplest truth. Ethan knew he should not explain too much in a room full of watching eyes. He also understood that Alex was trying to balance being a mother and being a CEO under dozens of gazes. There were things she wanted to say, but could not, because every word risked being interpreted. The way she positioned herself protectively in front of Emma said more than speech. Ethan recognized that and stayed silent for a second, giving her a small space to breathe. Emma took the initiative and signed a few words. Her hands lifted gently, the motions light but intentional, as if she wanted to tell her mother that the man in front of her was not causing harm. Alex watched her daughter's hands, not fully understanding the content, but sensing the new calm in Emma's eyes. She lightly touched her daughter's wrist, trying to grasp part of the meaning, but Emma looked to Ethan for confirmation. Ethan signed slowly, so Emma could restate the message, and Emma nodded. A group of guests near the glass doors began raising their phones higher. Small LED lights flickered across their faces. Some recorded out of curiosity, some to replay later, others because the moment felt stranger than anything usually seen at a polished gala. The phones made the air feel heavier. Ethan noticed the attention converging on him, the very thing he always avoided. It made him retreat inward by a beat, yet his hands maintained their slow rhythm because Emma was still watching him for stability. If he stepped away right now, Emma might slip back into the tight panic she had been in before he approached. He signed a few more motions, describing a silent counting rhythm to maintain mental balance. Emma closed her eyes for the first 2 counts, then opened them with more steadiness. Alex saw the change, and her gaze softened by half a beat. She said nothing, but the tension she had been holding eased gradually. She could not deny the effectiveness of the movements Ethan was using, and that realization unsettled her more than the noise or the surrounding stares. A mother, watching her child calm down in someone else's hands, always leaves an uncomfortable hollow just beneath the breastbone. A server slipped past the 3 of them, bowing slightly in apology, as he needed to place another tray of pastries on the nearby table. The small movement made Emma tense reflexively. Ethan immediately signed a simple, calming gesture, and she slowly dropped her shoulders again. Alex continued to watch, her eyes lifting slightly, as if trying to memorize every detail so she could do the same herself later. But she did not intervene. She stood close enough to protect, without making Emma feel surrounded. An older guest approached and spoke in a voice not meant to be discreet. He remarked that the girl seemed calmer when the man signed to her. Alex's shoulders stiffened. She turned to the guest with a polite smile and replied briefly that Emma often struggled in crowded settings and that she herself was learning sign language to better support her daughter. The guest nodded and moved on, but the remark left a thin sting across Alex's expression. Emma looked up at Ethan and signed a short sentence, the tone in her eyes asking whether he was still there. Ethan signed back that he was, and that she was doing very well. Emma smiled truly. For the second time that night, her face lit up, standing in complete contrast to the cold heaviness around her. Whispers began to spread from one corner of the room to another. Phrases like, "That guy looks like outsourced staff. He knows what to do better than her mother. See, a stranger handled the hardest part," drifted through the air, like scraps of paper tossed toward a single center. Alex heard them. Ethan heard them. Neither responded, because neither could. Emma was the only one untouched by the words, her eyes still following each movement of Ethan's hands. Ethan wanted to step back and return the space to Alex, but when he lowered his hands, Emma tilted her head slightly, as if asking why he had stopped. He signed a few final words, short and complete, letting her feel that everything was okay and that he would leave her with her mother. Emma signed back 3 small words. Their meaning made Ethan pause. She said that he truly heard her. In that moment, a faint smile touched the corner of her mouth, a kind of smile not meant to be seen by anyone else, only the relief of feeling lighter. The chandelier light reflected in her eyes, making the moment sharp and clear amid the layered noise of the event. Ethan stepped back one pace to let Alex move closer to her daughter, but the soundscape of the ballroom shifted again. Laughter thinned, murmurs thickened, cameras kept recording. And the final line of this part came from a group standing near the doors, spoken low but carrying all the way to the 3 of them. A contract employee doing better than the CEO? The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted completely the moment Emma smiled at Ethan. The emotional slip of the room did not happen loudly. It was as subtle as a breath being drawn back, yet enough for the most perceptive to sense that the axis of power had just wavered. All gazes, instead of resting on the child who had just come out of panic, turned at once toward Alex, as a spotlight reversed onto someone standing center stage without warning. Alex's assistant pushed through a few guests, stopped close beside her, and whispered, his voice clearly off rhythm. He said, "Don't let this scene leak out." His hand trembled, the phone nearly slipping from his palm. The glowing screen cast light onto the collar of his suit jacket, notifications from the company's internal group appearing in rapid succession like pinpricks. Alex only needed a glance to know the situation had already moved beyond the ballroom. A guest near the bar watched the mother struggle, while Ethan remained kneeling at Emma's eye level. That person spoke bluntly enough to make several heads turn. He said, "That child needs someone, not her." The words struck Alex harder than the lights aimed at her face. They were not loud, but they spread like a thin wave, skimming table edges and slipping into many ears. Alex forced her breathing back into rhythm. She lowered herself and signed to Emma again, trying to regain control. But her movements failed to match Emma's newly found rhythm. Too fast, then mistimed, her hands grasping at space as meaning slipped past. Emma leaned her head back slightly, then shifted aside, as if Alex's signing no longer aligned with the emotional current she had just found. And before Alex could adjust, Emma lightly grasped Ethan's sleeve, an unconscious but unmistakable action. Ethan saw Emma's uncertainty and bent a little lower to bring her back to steady ground. He spoke softly, "Just hold lightly. I'm here." His voice was low and even, like laying a soft path beneath Emma's feet so she could stand without slipping. Emma responded by adjusting her grip, holding firm but not tight. In that moment, Alex stepped back half a pace, her eyes carrying a mix of loss and alert caution. A white flash cut straight across Alex's face, making her freeze. A guest at a nearby table had turned on their flash to record video. Then, 2 or 3 more phones were raised, screen light spilling across Alex's face as she struggled to maintain composure. She could not avoid all the light. She only angled her shoulders slightly, like reacting to a strong gust of wind. That motion was immediately read by those around her as a sign of strain. A director standing by the window lifted his wrist as his smartwatch vibrated sharply. The The screen showed the words, "Clip shared," internally. He frowned, then looked up at Alex with an expression that hovered between concern and judgment. Those nearby caught the look, and a fresh layer of murmurs rose, fragments drifting through the air. Ethan heard the overlapping whispers. He wanted to step back, to reduce the pressure turning toward him. As he shifted, Emma gently tugged his sleeve to keep him there, light but enough to stop him. Ethan realized that any sudden movement might cost Emma her anchor. He took a breath and stayed still, letting dozens of eyes settle on his back. Alex tried to reclaim control. She stepped closer to Ethan, her face tightening to preserve composure, while her chest felt constricted. She said, "You crossed a line." Each word landed cleanly, as if cut straight into the air. She did not shout or sharpen her tone. She simply spoke clearly enough not to be swallowed by the background music. Ethan lifted his gaze to her. His eyes did not resist, but they did not retreat. He saw the conflict in Alex's expression and understood she was standing between two borders, the image of a CEO and the responsibility of a mother facing a trembling child. But Ethan also heard the room, every whisper, every phone light sweeping across his face and hers. A guest near the photo backdrop turned to a friend and spoke in a low but audible voice. He said it looked like a stranger was handling the situation better than the person in charge. The remark spread fast, like a taut wire, pulling anxiety tight between the two adults in front of Emma. Each whisper acted like another gust, tilting the balance further. Alex wanted to pull Emma back toward herself. She reached out and lightly touched her daughter's shoulder. But Emma was still unsteady, leaning more toward Ethan, as if afraid of losing the only support keeping her upright amid the noise. Alex withdrew her hand slightly, as though she had touched something fragile. A group of younger guests raised their phones higher to capture the entire scene, as if witnessing something rare. Light from multiple screens blurred Alex's vision for a moment. She took another breath, longer this time, gathering whatever strength she had left to avoid revealing more of her fracture. Emma looked at Ethan, then at her mother, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. Ethan met her gaze calmly, answering without words that he was still there, right where he stood. Alex turned fully toward Ethan. She was about to say something more, to reassert control. But at the exact moment she opened her mouth, whispers from behind rose again, clear enough that her words caught in her throat. Attention had tilted completely toward her, not to see what she would do next, but to wait for her to falter again. Alex saw it clearly. The murmurs filled the space. Her image was being peeled away layer by layer as videos were shared onward. The sensation of being struck at her weak point spread like a cold cut down her spine. Ethan remained where he was, keeping his voice steady so Emma would not startle. When Alex stepped forward another half pace, he understood that the next second would define how the room saw the relationship between the two adults. One fighting to hold control, the other never expecting to become the unintended center. Alex asked again, her voice lower and thinner than before, but Ethan had decided not to step aside. He exhaled slowly, then answered with the sentence many people would repeat for the rest of the night. "That line doesn't exist because of me." The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted suddenly when attention no longer centered on Ethan as it had moments before, but was drawn directly to Emma. She stood between the two adults, yet her gaze was no longer unsteady. Her small hands moved calmly in front of her chest, each sign clear and firmly paced, as if in the last few minutes she had found a private, safe corner of her own within this noisy world. She signed a sentence slowly, like a confirmation to herself that you use the right rhythm, not fast, not scary. Ethan received the sign with a very slight softening at the corner of his mouth. He did not mean to show emotion, but Emma noticed. He replied with a sentence equally clear in its movements, saying, "I say that to Noah every night." The name Noah lit a small point in Emma's eyes. She looked up at Ethan, curious about the child who shared fears like hers, about the idea that someone else out there understood the world she lived in. A group of younger guests, standing near the glass railing, watched the scene, then whispered among themselves. One of them said, "Single father. That explains it." The murmuring spread like a thin ripple, without malice, but enough to reach Alex, standing right behind her daughter. Alex heard it and felt her chest tighten, not because they mentioned Ethan, but because they were drawing a boundary between her and her daughter with a single, blunt sentence. Alex stood half a step behind Emma, close enough to reach out, yet unsure where to place her hand. The space between her and her child had just been entered by something unseen, not by a body, but by something she had long believed she was learning to reach. When Emma looked at Ethan with eyes brightened, Alex felt as if she had dropped something she never imagined she could lose. Ethan remained kneeling at Emma's eye level, not moving closer, not pulling away. He simply waited in case Emma needed something more to sign. But Emma turned her head slightly and looked toward Alex. She lifted her hand, fingers moving gently, and spoke to her mother in the way she spoke best. "Mom, sign slower." The sentence carried no blame, yet it made Alex's face pause for the briefest beat. Alex had learned to sign, but learning with the wrong rhythm could fracture an entire sentence halfway through. Emma was telling her that, in the gentlest way, she could. Alex raised her hand, palm facing Emma, in an effort to correct what had just happened. She intended to sign more slowly, as her child had asked, but her hand stopped in midair when it reached chest level. Her fingers trembled slightly, as if held back by a truth she did not want to face. She lowered her hand, her breath shortening for a single second. Emma watched that moment with a child's eyes that meant no harm. Her body still angled toward Ethan, but her eyes turned to her mother, as if asking something that sign language was not yet enough to express. Alex only looked back, her fragile smile seeming to lose half its strength. The people around them understood what was unfolding on different levels. Some felt moved by seeing a child soothed in the right way. Some were surprised that the mother was not the one able to do it. Others felt curious, studying Alex's expression, trying to guess what, for the first time in this polished evening, had slipped beyond her control. Ethan stayed where he was. He did not step into the space between mother and child, nor did he withdraw his presence. He understood that if he pulled away completely, Emma might drift back into the vast emptiness she had just escaped. But he also recognized that if he stayed too long, Alex would feel the backward spotlight burning more sharply. That sensation was more uncomfortable than the fading noise around them. Emma lightly touched her mother's sleeve, this time not to cling, but like an invitation to come closer. Alex looked down at the small hand, then turned her gaze to Ethan. In her eyes was a question larger than anything she had heard in the ballroom. What made a stranger know how to calm her daughter better than she could? Ethan saw that look and understood it was not directed at him as blame. It was the look of a mother finally facing the space she should have filled long ago. He breathed slowly, preparing to stand, but did not move yet. As long as Emma still looked to him for rhythm, he could not leave too quickly. Alex took a deep breath. She tried to lift her hand again, carefully adjusting each movement in her mind. But Emma tilted her head and waited, without pressure. In that moment, mother and daughter stood facing a truth that could no longer be avoided. It was not that the mother had not tried. She had, but Emma's world demanded more than effort. It required patience, repetition, time, hands that did not shake, and a heart unafraid of other people's eyes. Alex had a position and power. The one thing she did not have was the rhythm her daughter lived in. A group of guests standing to the left spoke quietly among themselves, saying that this scene showed a kind of power rarely seen. Not the power of title or money, but the power of understanding. One of them remarked that the party lights were shining in the wrong place when they should have been aimed at the child who had just been seen through her own language. Ethan shifted slightly, still kneeling, leaning back just enough to give Alex space. He signed a sentence to Emma, gentle and slow, saying that she could give her mother time, that her mother was also trying to see her in the way she needed. Emma received it, her eyes softening, though she continued to look at her mother with quiet expectation. Alex caught every rhythm of that singing, every word carried by Ethan's hands that should have been hers to give. A feeling that was both defeat and awakening passed through her chest, drawing out another breath, deeper and longer than any she had taken all evening. Ethan rose slowly, keeping his eyes level with Alex's, not lower like someone apologizing, not higher like someone claiming victory, but at the height of two adults looking at the child between them. He understood that his presence had touched the most fragile thread in Alex's role as a mother. He also knew that Emma had just come through something difficult. Alex looked at Ethan, her eyes holding a mix of gratitude, confusion, and hurt. She let her hands fall and allowed a trace of her real voice to slip out from beneath the trained CEO exterior. A tired voice, but not a broken one. Ethan tilted his head slightly, looked at Emma, then back at Alex, before speaking the final line of this part, a sentence that carried more than its literal meaning. Learning more isn't enough. After the moment Ethan stood up, and his final words still hovered in Alex's mind, the ballroom began moving again, but it did not return to its previous state. Everything felt shifted by a single degree. People no longer bothered to hide their scrutiny. Eyes followed Alex more than they followed the party itself. The most unsettling part was the silence from those with real power in the room, the kind of silence that watches, registers, and prepares to carry the story beyond these walls. Alex drew in a deep breath, kept Emma close, and tried to pull everything back into its usual rhythm. She placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder so lightly that only Emma could feel it. Emma looked up at her mother, traces of fear still lingering in her eyes, but calm enough now not to curl inward. Ethan stood at a distance, quiet, as if erasing himself from the center. Only someone attentive would notice that his eyes never left Emma, tracking her reactions with the instinct of a father who had done this too many times before. A PR staffer in a black suit moved quickly to Alex's assistant. He leaned in and spoke softly, but his trembling voice gave him away. "The clip is out. We can't contain it anymore." The sentence pierced straight through the shell of composure Alex was trying to maintain. She did not turn around, but an unusually short breath made her shoulders lift slightly. From what she read in the eyes around her, she knew this was not a rumor. It had truly escaped, moving exactly the way internal media always did. Fast, cold, and with no way back. In the minutes that followed, phones throughout the ballroom began to vibrate. Some guests tried to be polite by hiding their phones beneath the tablecloths, but Alex still caught the flicker of light along the table edges. A group of female staff members whispered together, palms covering their screens, but failing to hide the caption that had just appeared. The words stood stark against the white glow. "An outsider understands the CEO's child better than the CEO herself." Short, sharp, like the edge of glass. It did not need malice. What it implied was enough to crack something deep inside Alex. She gripped her own phone so tightly that the hard casing seemed to dent. Her knuckles went white for a second, then flushed red again. A guest nearby noticed the clenched hand. Their face showed a flicker of discomfort, but only briefly. People admired a CEO's perfection, and they paid close attention when that perfection fractured. The message tone sounded from Alex's own phone. She opened it without daring to breathe too deeply. The message from the board secretary was brief, cold, and emotionless, in a way only those accustomed to boardrooms fully understood. "The board requests a report." Just 4 words, yet they left a hollow opening in Alex's stomach. She knew exactly what those words meant. No concern, no sympathy for an 8-year-old who had panicked at a party. They meant an assessment of how damaged the image was and how she intended to fix it. To the left, Ethan noticed the change in Alex's face. He saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. Not fear of others, but fear of something forming beyond her control. For the first time that evening, he saw power tremble. He had seen people afraid of losing their standing before, but Alex's fear was different. It was the fear of a mother realizing she was losing something very close, very small, something few people noticed, yet the most vital part of her private life. Ethan said nothing. He stood still, as if any sound might make things fracture further. It was the same way he used to stand when Noah hid against the cabinet during thunderstorms that shook the window frames, unmoving, creating a quiet anchor. Emma lightly touched Alex's hand with 2 fingertips, then signed a small sentence in front of her chest. "Mom, are you scared?" Her signing was slow and clear. Accidentally cutting through the calm Alex was trying to rebuild. A child's question can be the most painful one, because children do not know when they have touched the thing adults hide most carefully. Alex froze. She looked at her daughter, her eyes seeming to slip free of every layer of makeup. It was as if the ceiling lights had landed exactly on the spot she had been trying to conceal for months. No one nearby fully caught Emma's signed sentence, but anyone perceptive could read from Alex's face that a mask had been stripped away in an instant. The assistant stepped in right after, trying to help by suggesting that Alex could leave the party, but Alex remained where she was. She did not want to turn away now. Each retreat from a situation was an admission of weakness. Yet, at this threshold, staying also exposed something she had not dared to face for 8 years, that the distance between mother and daughter did not come from a lack of love, but from her never slowing down enough to enter her child's language. Another guest approached, showing a phone to a friend, whispering that the clip was spreading to the collaborator groups. The friend replied that this would certainly reach the board. The comment struck like a second needle into the thin air surrounding Alex. She pressed her lips together and regulated her breathing. No one was looking at Emma anymore. Everyone was looking at her. The more eyes there were, the more the space between her and her daughter compressed until it felt suffocating. Ethan sensed the situation, turning in a dangerous direction. He looked at Alex, then at Emma, then at the whispering crowd. He understood that if he walked away now, people would interpret it in ways harmful to both mother and child. But if he stayed too close, they would believe Alex was being replaced in her role. Every move forward or back was wrong. It was the most uncomfortable position for him, someone who preferred to remain unseen. Emma tightened her grip on her mother's sleeve, her face no longer tense as before, but marked by a different worry. Alex bent down and tried to smile, but her eyes could not follow. Every movement she had made all evening was being examined, every slight turn of her body, every touch on her daughter's shoulder. Part of her wanted to tell Emma that everything would be all right, but she knew that would be an empty comfort, and Emma would see the hollowness immediately in her eyes. Alex's phone vibrated again, this time not with a single notification, but a string of them. The screen lit up with short messages from her assistant, from PR, from the board secretary. The final one was slightly longer, but enough to make Alex's chest tighten, as if her breath had been caught. The message read, 7 a.m. meeting. Explanation required. After the notification, 7 a.m. meeting. Explanation required, appeared on Alex's phone screen. The air around her seemed to thicken into an invisible layer. The ballroom was still bright, the music still running exactly as planned for the evening. But every sound that reached Alex felt warped and distant, as if passing through a thick pane of glass. Emma's smile from moments ago, pure and full of meaning, was now surrounded by dozens of worries settling heavily onto Alex's shoulders. Alex gently tightened her grip on Emma's hand, not to pull her away, but to recheck the small warmth in her palm. She had to leave the ballroom before those gazes turned into stories carried into the next day. But she also had to leave, while her own breathing had not yet found a steady rhythm. She guided her daughter toward the exit, each step carefully controlled, though the heels concealed a faint tremor. The moment the ballroom doors closed behind them, Alex bent down and slipped one heel off her foot to ease the sharp ache climbing her spine. The empty hallway made her breathing echo into isolated sounds. The soft yellow lights slowed everything by a beat. Alex placed a hand against the wall to steady herself, her face openly showing exhaustion, something she never allowed others to see. A PR staffer hurried down the hallway toward them, his face tight as if he had just run through a storm of news. He stopped in front of Alex and spoke plainly, coldly, striking at the most painful point. The press will ask why you let your child cry during the event. The question landed like a knife driven into already unstable ground. Alex did not respond immediately. She looked at Emma, at the small eyes that had brightened again, but now carried worry at seeing her mother surrounded by adults. Alex lowered her voice and spoke the sentence she had been holding inside since everything began. Because I'm her mother. She did not force strength into her tone anymore. The words came out as lightly as a long breath, carrying more self-blame than defense. The PR staffer paused, caught off guard by that sound. He was used to the sharp, unyielding version of Alex, so this rare softness left him unsure how to reply. Ethan followed a few steps behind, keeping Emma within his sight. He did not step into the conversation, but when he noticed the slight shift in Emma's eyes under the weight of the adult's words, he knew she needed an anchor again. He removed his light jacket and gently draped it over Emma's shoulders. He spoke in a low voice, almost meant only for her. You're okay now. His calm flowed like water into the invisible hollow opening along the hallway. Emma clutched the edge of the jacket and signed a small sentence, very softly, but clear enough for Ethan to see and understand. She said, "Don't let Mom be sad." The words were innocent in the way children mean them, not comfort, but a simple wish. Yet, they made Ethan choke. A child only says that when she sees her mother under pressure, she can no longer hide. He lowered his head, hiding a deep breath. Alex heard Emma singing even though she did not fully grasp the meaning. Still, she sensed something. When Emma touched the cuff of the jacket and looked up at her, Alex realized her child was trying to comfort her. That realization caused Alex's chest to sink deeply, as if the 8-year-old were carrying a weight that should have belonged to adults. Murmurs from inside the ballroom slipped through the not-quite-closed door. A male voice, buried in the noise but still clear enough, said, "That it guy is finished." The sentence landed like a stone thrown into a pond, already rippling with waves. Ethan heard it clearly. He straightened for a second, heat rising from his spine to his shoulders. He had never wanted attention. For him, doing the right thing for one night already crossed the limit of what someone like him could afford. He knew they were talking about him. He also knew the cost would not be small. Ethan remained where he stood, but in his mind, he could already see the path ahead, one where people like him were not meant to stay under the lights for long. He did not regret kneeling in front of Emma, because he knew Noah had once needed the same thing. But he also knew this action would force him to explain himself, or even take responsibility in ways he could not control. It felt like stepping into the light when he had only intended to watch from the shadows. Alex had not yet realized how deeply those words from the ballroom had struck Ethan. She was being pulled into the heavy thoughts of the coming morning. The board would not easily overlook internal media spreading on Christmas night, when the event was meant to project a flawless image. Alex stared at a blurred spot on the wall, her breath seeming to catch in her chest. Emma tugged lightly at her mother's sleeve, then placed her hand on the back of Alex's hand. Alex realized her daughter was calling her back. Emma did not sign a long sentence, only a single word. But when Alex looked into her eyes, she saw the worry still lingering from the ballroom, a trace that had not faded. She bent down and pressed her forehead to her daughter's, a silent apology. In that brief moment, Ethan did not look at Alex or Emma. He looked toward the far end of the hallway, where the long stretch of yellow light formed a quiet slope. He knew tonight would not end here. The two adults standing in this hallway would step into the next day, carrying two different kinds of fear, both tied to a child and to a video that could not be taken back. Alex turned fully toward Ethan. Her eyes reddened under the lights. She looked at him for the first time, without the CEO mask in place. Her voice was low and real, holding a mix of gratitude, anxiety, and a sense of the storm approaching. "Tomorrow, I don't know what they'll do to you either." When the three of them left the ballroom and stepped into the hotel's grand lobby, the air outside felt completely different from the suffocating space of the party. The Christmas night wind swept through the corridor, brushing Emma's hair and making the fine strands tremble like thin threads. The chill grazed her cheeks, enough to make her pause for a second. Emma held onto her mother's sleeve, her hand still lightly shaking after the chaos in the ballroom. The warm yellow lights cast a soft glow on her skin, but the cold outside easily slipped past her small jacket. Alex walked beside Emma, her heels lower than they had been hours earlier after she removed the high ones in the hallway. Her pace was slow, as if she were careful not to press further on, the fatigue etched across her face. She glanced at Ethan behind them for a brief moment, then let out a very quiet sigh, so soft she might not even have noticed it leave her lips. Saying thank you right now felt as difficult as stepping out of a role she had lived in for too long. Her emotions hovered in a thin mix of gratitude and shame, impossible to anchor into a clean sentence. Ethan moved a little closer to Emma when he saw her shoulders draw in against the wind. He bent down to her eye level so she could see his face without having to look up much. He spoke in a low voice, the kind he used when settling Noah to sleep after exhausting days. "Go home and sleep. If it feels bad again, signal to your mom." His words were simple, light like Alex's earlier breath, but placed exactly where Emma could feel the thin circle of safety she had just lost when leaving the ballroom. Alex turned toward Ethan when she heard him. Her look carried a hard mix to name: gratitude, awkwardness, and the truth that she still did not know how to face him. Ethan asked for nothing, expected no recognition, and that calm neutrality made Alex feel as though she were carrying yet another layer of fault. She said nothing. Her silence weighed as heavily as the darkness behind them. A black luxury car sped past the street in front of the hotel. The sound of tires sliding over wet pavement stretched the streetlights into long reflections. The driver glanced at the three of them, his look like someone catching a strange scene, an irregular fragment cutting into a polished holiday night. None of them reacted, but the moment quietly underlined how far they had drifted from the evening's main current. Alex opened her car door, but when her hand touched the handle, it hesitated. The pause lasted only a heartbeat, yet it was long enough for Emma to notice. She was faltering inside the very role everyone believed she mastered. That single moment of stillness revealed a mind crowded with whispers, notifications, a 7 a.m. meeting, and a fear shaped like the word image. Emma climbed into the car first, then turned back to look at her mother as if asking whether she needed help. Alex answered with a gentle stroke through her hair, then settled into the driver's seat. Ethan remained outside, a few steps away, not wanting to intrude, but also unwilling to leave, while he was not sure Emma was all right. Once Alex was inside, she looked at Ethan again through the car window. There was something in her gaze like a question held halfway, as if she wanted to speak about what had happened in the ballroom, to explain or to take responsibility. But every sentence stopped before it formed. Ethan stood straight, hands tucked into his coat pockets for warmth, his face free of demand or judgment. He stayed because Emma was still watching him through a narrow gap in the window. The wind pressed lightly against Ethan's back. He stepped forward one pace and spoke softly, just enough for Alex to hear without unsettling Emma. "Tomorrow, whatever comes up, I'll answer." A short sentence, heavy with responsibility. It showed that Ethan had already accepted the consequences he had not foreseen when he knelt in front of Emma. He did not say he was right. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply claimed his part, and that was enough for Alex to understand what he was trying to protect. Emma turned to look at him, her small eyes blinking once. She did not understand the words fully, but she understood the way he said them, understood that he was preparing to step into a difficult tomorrow. Children sense shifts in adults long before they grasp literal meaning. Ethan caught that look and felt a quiet ache. Alex held Ethan in her gaze for another long beat. She thought of the 7 a.m. meeting. She thought of how the board would dissect the clip, every action, every expression. She knew they would not care about Emma's feelings in that moment. They would care that she had allowed an important event to become a source of image leakage. Every word spoken tomorrow would cut into the part she did not want exposed. The distance between her and Emma, the failure in her role as a mother, laid bare before dozens of witnesses. Ethan could not read every layer of that thought in Alex's eyes, but he felt its weight. He did not move forward or step back. That hesitation lasted only a few seconds, yet it left both adults standing on a fragile line between gratitude and separation. A passerby on the nearby sidewalk glanced at the three of them as if watching a scene from a film missing its final line. Anyone close enough would have felt the same, as though something deeply private were drifting into the cold air. Suddenly, Alex turned away from the driver's seat. She opened the car door and stepped back out, surprising Ethan slightly. She stood squarely in front of him, her eyes reddening under the lights after an hour of accumulated strain. She did not speak at length. Her voice was low, smooth, close to breaking. "Tomorrow, they don't need answers. They need someone to blame." Morning arrived too early. Outside, the city still held a trace of mist clinging to the sidewalks, but inside the high-rise building where Alex worked, time was already moving faster, sharper, and colder. Ethan entered the main lobby alongside several other employees, even though he did not belong to the 7 a.m. rhythm of executive floors. He had been summoned by a brief message from the project manager, instructing him to attend an emergency meeting. He understood what that meant. When an invisible person is pulled into a management room, he becomes evidence, not a witness. He took a deep breath and kept his steps steady, careful not to show hesitation. Upstairs, Alex walked down the corridor leading to the meeting room. Her low shoes made contact with the floor so softly that they were nearly silent. Her face had gone pale after a night with almost no sleep, every line sharpened under the white lights, as if traced by a cold needle. Emma was asleep at home, yet her words from the car the night before clung to Alex, making each step feel as if something were pulling her back. Still, She had to enter that room, because it was where her image, her future, and the distance between her and Emma would be placed on the scale like merchandise. When Alex reached the meeting room door, she saw the glass already slightly ajar. White light spilled from inside into the hallway, cutting coldly into her eyes. Stepping in, she realized the room was lit like an interrogation chamber. Ceiling lights shone straight down onto the long black table, making its polished surface reflect every small movement. Alex sat at the head of the table, back straight, hands resting on her lap, face pale, while her eyes struggled to remain steady. The room had no windows, only white walls and cold light, sealing everything into a closed box. A director across from her opened a laptop, turned the screen toward himself, and read aloud a line of statistics. He said, "The video reached 200 internal shares overnight." The sentence rang through the room like an opening indictment, leaving no room to debate its seriousness. Several others lowered their heads to take notes, their faces blank. The laptop tilted slightly, reflecting a harsh glare across the table, forming a long streak like a sharp cut. Alex sat motionless, her gaze never leaving the speaker. She did not lower her head, though her breathing compressed into short beats beneath her ribs. One night had been enough for her to understand the depth at which this would be dissected. They would not ask whether Emma was all right, nor discuss what caused the child's panic. They would analyze the image, responsibility, and damage. Those words had been circling her mind since 4 in the morning. Now, others were simply voicing them. Ethan was called in a few minutes later. He opened the meeting room door and saw the long table filled with people. All eyes lifted at once, causing a brief moment of awkwardness. He stepped inside and stopped at the end of the table, hands clasped together to hide the tremor, though his palms were damp. One of the directors asked directly, without detour, as if Ethan were not a person, but a function in a report. "Why did you approach the child?" Ethan drew in one breath before answering. He replied plainly, as bare as the truth allowed. "She was in pain." He finished and remained silent, adding nothing else. He did not try to build a favorable image or justify himself. That was the only thing he had seen when he entered the ballroom the night before. A child in pain. The answer caused a few raised brows, because they had expected a longer explanation to analyze. Ethan's bluntness made it difficult to redirect the narrative the way they intended. Another man, hair fully white but eyes sharp, typed into a file on his tablet. Though his fingers moved lightly, the words he entered were cold enough that even Alex caught them in the brief pause between voices. He typed, "Exceeded scope of duty," a sentence that sounded more like a conclusion than an observation. Ethan heard the soft tapping on the glass, but did not look over. He knew it meant he had stepped beyond the role of a contracted employee. Alex shifted slightly when she heard it. She wanted to speak, to explain that last night's situation was not a standard task, that the child had been panicking and Ethan had acted on a father's instinct. But before she could open her mouth, the person beside her raised a hand and said, in a voice cold as a metal blade, "We are discussing individual responsibility, not emotion." The sentence pushed Alex back into her chair, as if pulling her away from the impulse to protect anyone. She lowered her hand and fixed her gaze on the space at the center of the table. The meeting room froze for several seconds. Every small sound became amplified. A pen slid lightly across the tabletop, producing a thin noise. A sheet of paper lifted briefly in the air conditioning and fell back down with a soft crackle. Ethan looked around, studying each face, realizing that no one here wanted the story. They wanted a label for the fault, and he vaguely understood that the name might be his, or Alex's, or both. He stood still, eyes neither evasive nor defiant. He waited. Alex looked down at her fingers. They trembled slightly, but she held her posture. She thought of the things she had not said to Emma the night before, thought of her daughter's eyes when she hesitated at the car door. She knew there would soon be questions that pierced through her image, through her role as a mother, through the fact that she had failed to calm Emma in time. Each was a fragment she would have to gather in this room, under white lights that exposed every deviation. A light tap from the chairperson's pen signaled the next phase of discussion. He looked around the room, then, at Alex and Ethan in turn, his gaze sweeping over them as if measuring endurance. The air tightened until it felt difficult to breathe. The chairperson spoke, his voice even but cold enough to stiffen Alex's back. Before we go further, we need to determine who bears the greatest responsibility. After the chairperson's statement, the room sank into a prolonged silence. There were very few places in this building where silence carried such weight that the air itself became a pane of frosted glass, separating everyone inside. But the meeting room that morning held exactly that kind of quiet. Alex sat upright, her hands clasped at the edge of the table, her eyelids fixed in a position that avoided blinking too quickly so she would not reveal any wavering. Ethan stood at the far end of the table, forcing his breathing into an even rhythm under more than a dozen eyes examining every small detail of him. A director seated near the head of the table leaned forward, elbows planted on the surface as if preparing to dissect the entire previous night. He looked straight at Ethan, without preamble, and asked in a tone used to examine a suspect, "Did you intend to draw attention?" Each word dropped onto the tabletop like small stones, bouncing once before sinking, sending ripples no one wanted to touch. Ethan met his gaze, neither lowering his eyes nor hardening his voice. He answered quietly, holding to the same truth that had existed since the moment he saw Emma trembling by the wall. "I didn't want anyone to look at me." He spoke honestly, the same way he had spoken the night before, a short sentence carrying the fatigue of someone who had lived his entire life at the edges of rooms. That truth caused a slight shift around the table. Some lips curved faintly. Some eyes dropped to the documents. Truth is sometimes harder to accept than an elaborate defense. A man seated to the left, pen in hand, wrote into the minutes almost without thinking. On the page appeared a rigid line, uncooperative, just 4 words, yet they rose like a barrier placed directly in front of Ethan. He did not look at Ethan while writing, as if the notation were simply part of their process. Alex caught the movement of the pen out of the corner of her eye. She clenched her hands beneath the table, her knuckles pushing up slightly as if they might break through the skin. She opened her mouth, her voice low but clear enough for the entire room to hear. "This is not his fault." She articulated each word carefully, as if trying to pull the focus back to where it belonged. Several gazes turned toward her, carrying surprise. That kind of defense was not typical of Alex in meetings. It sounded more human than executive. Immediately, however, the man seated beside Ethan turned his head toward Alex. His eyes were not sharp, but keen, like a blade carefully honed. He asked quickly, stressing every word, "Then whose fault is it?" The question was not meant to find an answer. It was meant to force Alex into a narrow passage where anything she said could be twisted into a weakness. The room fell into another stretch of silence. A few people flipped pages without needing to read them. Someone else tapped the tip of a pen against the table in a steady rhythm, the sound echoing like a clock marking the time Alex was losing control. Ethan remained still, his head tilting slightly downward, unsure whether being defended had only pushed Alex into greater danger. Alex tightened her grip even more. Her palms warmed with the rush of blood, while her shoulders went cold under the pressure bearing down from every stare. She drew in a very light breath and closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Just one. Yet that second was enough for those watching to notice the fatigue she had been hiding since the night before. When she opened her eyes again, her face was still firm, but the firmness no longer held together as it once had. Ethan saw the change. He guessed Alex was trying to keep Emma out of the story being built in this room because Emma did not belong here. But he also understood that she was being forced to hold the role of CEO, and that role did not allow her to speak the one thing that could explain everything to the room. Her daughter had gone through a real panic attack, and a panicking child had nothing to do with corporate image. Here, however, everything was fed into the same logic press, operated by people who saw only numbers and media. The silence stretched long enough that even the hum of the air conditioning sounded clear, like wind slipping through a narrow crack. Someone at the far end of the table turned a stack of papers and began to ask Ethan the next question, his voice dropping as if testing a reflex. But the question dissolved before it took shape, because all attention had converged on Alex. She straightened her back further, as if preparing for an answer that might turn into a weapon against herself. But before she could speak, the chairperson tapped his pen lightly against the table. The sound was not loud, yet it was enough to pull the entire conversation back to the exact point they intended to drill into. A board member who had not spoken since the start of the meeting suddenly leaned forward, hands clasped together like someone ready to deliver a final cut. His voice was not raised or forceful, but it carried a coldness that made anyone's spine want to draw back. He asked, "If you can't control your own child, how can you control the company?" The room held on to the bone-chilling silence that followed the final question directed at Alex. It was like a dense fog wrapping around every person seated at the long table, leaving no opening for breath to pass through easily. Alex sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the tabletop for a brief moment before lifting to meet the gaze of the man who had asked the question. She said nothing, not because she lacked an answer, but because she understood that any words at this point could be interpreted against her, twisted, and turned into a weapon aimed back at herself. A director seated near the glass wall set his pen down and leaned slightly into his chair. He scanned the room, then spoke as if to shatter the suffocating air with a decisive statement. He said, "The child only calmed down when someone else signed." The sentence struck the meeting room like a hammer hitting stone. Several people tilted their heads to gauge Alex's reaction, while others took notes, as if logging a critical piece of evidence in an internal inquiry. Alex interlaced her hands, fingers tightening until the joints showed white. She tried to keep her gaze firm, but the fatigue accumulated from the night into morning dulled the color of her eyes. She drew in a breath, not deep, but enough for the words to come out like a small confession. "I am learning." Her voice was hoarser than usual, like that of someone who had stayed awake all night and was clinging to meaning, to remain upright under the pressure closing in. The words made several pens freeze mid-air, but before the brief hush could settle, someone else pushed back with a challenging tone, intent on driving her to the edge of indictment. 8 years, and still not enough? His voice was tight and contained, leaving Alex no path to turn. It wrapped around her wrists like a binding cord, pulling her another step deeper into the trap. Ethan stood at the end of the table, his hands tightening slightly without intention. He wanted to say something, to step in, and absorb part of the blow aimed at Alex. He understood that those 8 years were not years of indifference. He knew there were years of a mother running a company while trying to learn a language that the world outside often did not care about. He opened his mouth and drew in a breath, ready to speak, then stopped. In this room, he was not allowed to become central. If he intervened, they would immediately turn him into the cause, or worse, into proof that Alex had failed as a mother. He swallowed the words on his tongue. A senior executive with graying hair slid a thin folder across the table toward the chairperson. When it hit the surface, the sound landed like a courtroom gavel. The man pointed his pen at the first page and said, "This is the internal feedback on the clip." Every person in the room followed the motion. Alex looked at the folder, even though no one told her to. Her eyes drifted down the lines of text on the page. The words were so cold, they felt like layers of ice spreading across the room's surface. She read one, "Lee, nay," and her face paled further. The sentence was clear. The CEO does not understand her own child. Alex's eyes stopped there, long enough that someone might have expected a rebuttal, but she only stared, as if the line were reflecting her through a warped mirror she could not break. Ethan saw Alex swallow hard, while keeping her chin steady. He lowered his head slightly, an instinctive gesture of someone witnessing pain he had no right to interrupt. He knew that sentence cut deeper than any criticism. It did not attack leadership ability, but the role Alex held more tightly than any rung on the corporate ladder. He felt himself pulled into the narrative without anyone looking at him. He was like a piece of evidence standing in the middle of the room, illustrating too clearly what they were saying. Even without eyes on him, he felt the spotlight pressing against the back of his neck. The air in the room thickened further. It grew so dense that the rustle of paper sounded like a blade slicing through silence. Every exit was blocked by the white light pouring down from the ceiling. The board members watched Alex as if examining a component in a vast corporate machine, assessing whether it could still function or had cracked at its core. Ethan straightened, placing his hands neatly at his sides, trying to hold the most neutral stance possible. No more and no less. He did not look at the folder. He fixed his gaze on the white wall ahead, as if there were a small point of light he needed to anchor himself to in order not to be pulled into the current of the room. Still, he could feel the weight pressing down on Alex's shoulders like invisible hands belonging to the board itself. Alex lifted her head and looked toward the chairperson. In that moment, she seemed like two people. One was the CEO fighting for her image, struggling to maintain the posture of calm leadership in a room filled with blades. The other was a mother being stripped of her mistakes in front of outsiders, as if 8 years of effort were erased by a few minutes in which she lost her child in a brightly lit room. The chairperson glanced at the folder, turned one more page, then closed it gently. There was no loud sound, yet the motion carried the weight of a declaration. He placed both hands on the folder and leaned toward Alex. His face showed no anger and no sympathy, only decision, the kind that makes anyone sitting across from him feel as though they are standing on thin ice. He restated the focus of the meeting with a direct sentence, as if steering the discussion away from emotion and back onto their chosen line of analysis. Then he spoke, each word measured, as though sealing the room against any further argument. We need to reassess leadership, starting today. After the chair's declaration, it was as if the meeting room floor tilted by a few degrees. Alex felt her shoulders slide slightly to one side, even though she was sitting straight, hands folded in her lap. The room was lit only by white ceiling lights, the kind of light that cuts sharply into every contour of a face. In that moment, Alex felt herself placed squarely at the center of that light, as if there were nowhere left to hide, no shadow left to step into. Her breathing thickened in her chest, the breath she had been holding back since the night before, finally pushing into her bloodstream. A board member took a stack of documents from the middle of the table, flipped a few pages, then read one line aloud. His voice was even, like someone reading a month-end report, without emotion. Reputational damage, increasing. Each word landed on the table like pebbles thrown into a lake, cold, dry, and sending wider ripples through Alex's mind. Everything she had built over the years, every presentation, every crisis she had steered through, every negotiation that ran late into the night, could fracture because of a few dozen seconds of video showing her 8-year-old child. Alex lifted a hand to her forehead, the movement slow and careful, as if moving any faster might collapse the last layer of strength she had left. She drew in a sharp breath, as though trying to pull some air back into this leadership tier, where every sentence was compressed to the point of cruelty. She knew they were not blaming Emma. They were blaming her, blaming the loss of control, blaming the presence of an outsider that made her image wobble. But hearing them quantify the damage the way they would stock prices made her understand that this place had never been meant to hold emotion. In the corner of the room, Ethan stood as close to the wall as possible, hands clasped together, eyes on the floor as if reminding himself to shrink so he would not create more disturbance. He stood like a shadow, a literal shadow of an invisible person dragged into this harshly lit room. He did not know whether he should leave or stay. If he left, they would see it as disrespect. If he stayed, they could interpret it as an attempt to justify himself. Any movement he made could be misread. A director lifted his eyes from the documents and looked straight at Ethan. His voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable note of dismissal. He is not a permanent employee. If necessary, his contract can be terminated. It was not a threat. It sounded like a decision waiting for a signature. The gazes in the room shifted slightly toward Ethan. Not a fair look, but an evaluating one. Ethan lowered his head. He answered with a sentence that did not dodge anything. I understand. His voice did not shake, but it carried enough restraint to signal he was holding himself back from saying more. He was used to standing on the margins, used to quiet judgment, used to being seen as replaceable at any time. But this sentence struck at what he feared most: Noah. If he lost his job, he knew he would have to find a way to keep his son's therapy, his schooling, everything a deaf child needed to not be left behind. That pain was something this room would never understand. Alex heard the words, I understand, and her entire body tightened for a beat. She looked up immediately, unable to hide the reaction. He did nothing wrong. The words came out unplanned, without strategy, without cushioning. It was the voice of someone hearing an injustice, the voice of a mother watching someone about to be blamed in her place. The sentence made 3 people near her lean back slightly in their chairs, as if they had just heard something unexpected. The man seated beside Alex turned his head, angling his face so the light caught his eyes, cold, like polished metal. He spoke to her, his voice low but sharp. Defending him is an admission of your weakness. The words were delivered like a small blade. The way he looked at her was not hostile, but heavy with disappointment. The disappointment of someone who believed Alex had stepped outside the role they expected her to play. He looked at her as if she had disrupted a perfect process. For a few seconds after that sentence, the room seemed to lose all sound. Everyone understood what it meant. If Alex continued to stand with Ethan, they would label her unfit to lead. But if she stayed silent, she would be allowing Ethan to carry all the consequences. She was trapped between two choices, both loaded with risk, both capable of taking something more valuable than her chair. Ethan glanced toward Alex, even though he knew he was not allowed to speak. He saw her eyes sway slightly, as if caught by an undertow. He saw fatigue in eyes that were usually sharp. Part of him wanted to say she did not need to protect him. Another part knew that if he spoke, they would use that to confirm she was biased. He stood frozen, like someone afraid of tipping a fragile glass right in front of him. Alex looked down at her hands. She thought they would be steady, but they had been trembling for some time. Her breath tangled in her chest, thoughts racing through her head at a dizzying speed. She saw Emma the night before, saw her small hands gripping Ethan's sleeve to find a breath. She saw that image twisted by this meeting room into a weakness. She saw Ethan being pushed into a corner, a man who had done the right thing, now paying for it because that right thing disrupted the smoothness of the system. Another board member said something, but Alex did not hear it clearly. Her ears rang. Each sentence from them felt like a hand dragging her down to the bottom of deep water, where layers of pressure did not allow her to surface. She knew they wanted a decision. They wanted to pin the fault on someone, and that person would either be her or Ethan. Ethan remained in the corner, where the light did not fall directly. He was too small to be fully seen, yet too significant to be ignored. He was not sure whether to look up or down. He chose to look at the space between the two people speaking, the most neutral position he could find, like a thin pillar standing in a storm about to break. Then someone slowly set a pen down on the table. The soft tap of wood against the surface made Alex flinch. Though quiet, it sounded like a verdict drawing closer. The people in this room were trained to analyze risk, identify weakness, and propose solutions. But today they were dissecting not a project, but a life, and the bond between a mother and her daughter. Alex felt like someone standing between two muddy roads. She understood that no one in this room cared what Emma had gone through the night before. They only cared about who was responsible for the clip. They did not care that Ethan was a single father or that Noah had endured similar nights of panic. They cared about their image. She was about to speak. She wanted to say that Ethan had done what any decent person would have done. She wanted to say they had no right to analyze how she mothered her child. But part of her understood that, saying it would only make things worse, and so she was placed in a position where silence was the only option left. Alex stayed silent. A silence, like someone receiving a suspended sentence without a lawyer. The meeting room door swung open, its hinge making a thin sound, like a needle lightly scratching glass. Warm yellow hallway light spilled in, stark against the cold white glare inside the sealed room. The shift in light felt like a new breath, but neither of the two stepping out had the strength to breathe deeply. Alex was the first to leave. No one had asked her to stand, but the pressure at the end of the meeting had built to the point where she could not stay another minute. She leaned her back against the hallway wall, one hand pressed to her chest, as if trying to steady a heartbeat knocked off balance by the final words inside. The skin around her eyes looked so worn that a fine vein twitched faintly at her temple. She stared at the floor for a long moment, then spoke very softly, the words slipping out like thin mist. "I'm more scared this morning than I was last night." The sentence was not aimed at anyone, but Ethan stood just behind her and heard it. It was the truth of someone pushed into the darkest corner of a role she had fought to hold for years, and the truth of a mother realizing she was being judged not by her work, but by the child she loved most. Ethan stepped out after her. When he heard that, he looked at Alex long enough to see the exhaustion the meeting room lights had laid bare. He lowered his head and answered quietly, as if speaking any louder might shatter the fragile space around them. "So am I." It was not polite to share. The night before, he had stepped out of invisibility. That morning, he had stood in a boardroom as a factor under review. And now, walking away from that room, he knew the risk of losing his job was no longer a risk, but a door already starting to close. The hallway stretched long, its stone floor polished enough to reflect their figures as if they were walking across shallow water. No one mentioned thanks. No one spoke of blame. Those words were too small compared to what weighed on each of them. Everything they had just heard in that lit room still clung to them, like the fine chalk dust of a trial that had not yet reached its verdict. Small footsteps sounded from the far end of the hall. Emma ran toward them, her hair tousled from a whole morning at home with the sitter. When she reached Alex, she stopped, eyes wide, looking at her mother as if at someone returned from far away. She raised her hands at chest level and signed a sentence, clear in every shape. "Mom, are you sad?" The way she asked made Alex sway slightly, as if yanked too fast from a room full of cold language back into her child's world. Alex pulled Emma into her arms before an answer could form. She held her as if to block every word she had just heard from reaching her back. Emma rested her head on her mother's shoulder, small hand at the back of Alex's neck, silent. She did not need an explanation. Children read eyes to know whether adults are all right, and Alex's eyes that morning had seen too much to hide it all. Ethan stood a few steps away, watching the two of them locked in that embrace. The image pulled him back to nights when Noah startled awake at the smallest noise outside the window. The same kind of hold, the same breathing slowing from sharp to steady. He understood better than anyone that Emma was not at fault. She was the center of the story, yet the adults in that boardroom treated her as a destabilizing variable. Ethan turned his face away, not to avoid looking, but to swallow the thin burn at his throat. He knew he had traded part of his future for a few seconds of a child's smile on Christmas night. It was not a choice he regretted, but it weighed on him differently now, heavy, like walking with a soaked coat clinging to his back. Alex kept holding Emma, but her eyes followed Ethan as he started to move a little farther away. The way he walked, slow and grounded, looked like someone carrying too much inside and not allowed to let any of it fall. An adult moving with the silence of someone who knows he did the right thing and knows the price of that right thing is high. Employees from other departments began passing through the hallway, cups of coffee in hand, trading documents, talking about the day's meetings. None of them knew that in this corner of the hall, the morning had carved a long cut into two adults. Each passerby flowed past like a current separate from Alex and Ethan's story, but it did nothing to lighten the weight in the air. Emma loosened her hold on her mother, looked up at her for another beat, then turned to look after Ethan as he walked away. She did not understand everything happening, but she knew this morning felt different. The way her mother breathed, the way Ethan stood, the way the yellow hallway light felt cold as it slid across their faces. All of it carried a strange unfamiliarity. Ethan stopped at the end of the hall, one hand resting on the edge of a glass door. He did not turn right away. He stood there for a second, like someone steadying his breath before stepping back into the outside world, where his job might already have dissolved into the words spoken in that meeting room. Alex watched him. She did not step forward. She did not call his name, but her face said more than any sentence she could force out. Part of her wanted to apologize. Another part wanted to protect him by keeping NG distance. That pulled her lips parting, then closing again. Ethan touched his side, checking his phone as if expecting a work message, even though he knew no good news was waiting. He let his hand drop, clenched it briefly, then released it, as if returning everything to the judgment of this morning. Alex watched his figure. The hallway light reflected in her eyes, making them brighter than usual, just enough to mask some of the red beneath. She opened her mouth, her voice barely loud enough for herself to hear. The question slipped out like a thread, pulled too tight for too long, finally snapping into sound. Does kindness survive in rooms of power? The story of Alex, Emma, and Ethan reminds us of a simple lesson that many adults too easily forget. Children do not need a perfect room. They need to be heard in their own language. What happened in the ballroom was not a child's tragedy, but a warning about how society so often prioritizes image over genuine emotion. A single father, with hands worn from signing, was able to do what an entire system of power could not because he was better, but because he was more sincere. From that small story, we see something larger. Kindness always has a cost, and the highest price often comes from the places with the most power. And sometimes, one ordinary act is enough to reflect how adults treat fragile things around them. If this story made you think, please share it so more people can reflect and learn. Thank you for staying until the end. I hope you felt the value in every moment. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories.